what I'm going to go through here is a little bit of review based on 5.10, but also just a few things I think we need to cover that haven't really been placed anywhere in the unit or didn't really make sense anywhere. But first, we'll start with 5.9, and that's what we went through at the end of last week. So it'll probably be kind of review for you. Remember, next class we have LEQ3, which will be your Unit 5 test. So you will want to be here on time for the next class. That would be my advice to you, because it will be due before you leave the next class. We need to start kind of tightening these time frames up so you guys are ready when we get to May to be able to take a time test. So like I said, 5.9 is really was the focus of the activity you did at the end of last week. But the kind of idea here, or the question we're asking ourselves, is how did industrialization change societies and living standards during this era? So we had the development of new classes, really the development of one new class and kind of a slight change to another, which I'll talk about in a second. The divergence of classes then meant different lives for different people living in different classes, as you might expect. And urbanization, or the move towards cities, created certain problems for people that were living in them that we're going to talk about as well. But again, it's stuff that probably you should have at least some familiarity with from the activity last week. So the middle class is the new class that emerges in this time. And understand that before this point, in most of the world, you really had the elites and everyone else, or the rest of us. It's not to say that was the case in every single part of the world, but parts of the world that were European or under the influence of Europeans, which at this point is a lot of the world, and also a lot of Asia and Southeast Asia as well, followed this kind of a structure where you essentially had an elite group and then everyone else was everyone else. The Industrial Revolution, and particularly industrial capitalism, changed that. It created a new middle class, kind of steeped in that idea of individual rights, private property ownership, and free trade, essentially. That led to the ability of people to kind of create an existence that was between the two classes, where you weren't extremely wealthy, you weren't one of the elites, but you were also doing better than the working class or the vast majority of people. For women, this had a big effect, because instead of having to work in some way, which before this time, even if not for a wage-paying job, women were still working. I mean, everyone's job was essentially survival before this point. And so women could work on things like household duties, but really importantly, child development. And that's going to have a knock-on effect, because those children that were fostered and educated will start in a much better position than a child that was working in a factory. And then if you imagine the next generation being able to build on whatever foundation they were kind of given by the previous, you can see how that very quickly would kind of lead to class stratification and kind of growing inequality that caused a lot of problems and fed into some of the revolutions we've been talking about. So like I said, most people remain poor. Most of us were still the working poor. Some of those stayed in agricultural jobs, but others moved to cities to work in factories and kind of be a part of this industrial revolution that was going on. Especially at the start, as you see there, but really all throughout, a lot of them were working in really dangerous conditions, very unsafe, unclean, or just being overworked, working 12-hour days sometimes, stuff like that. For the working class, women and children almost entirely would have held wage-paying jobs, because they would have needed to help support their family's income. And so those children were not being educated, their development was not being fostered, they were working. So like I said, this is the other side of that kind of coin. And if you did the work from last week and read through that Harvard Business Review article, you kind of saw what I was getting to in terms of the kind of impact today in the United Kingdom that these changes created. So this shows you the year that each country had a city with more than 1 million people. So we're only talking under 150 years ago here. Just the last century in South America and most of Europe. Obviously, Baghdad and China had a couple. But outside of that, you can see it's fairly recent that parts of the world had major cities. So it's a relatively new phenomenon. That's what I'm trying to get at. And the effects we're still kind of grappling with, to be honest. Urbanization is just the process by which a city forms or kind of grows. More people living in a concentrated area. Tenement housing was a type of low-income housing that was built during this time, and many of them essentially just became urban slums. You had groups of poor people living in really crowded, really dirty conditions, the buildings falling apart, the infrastructure in the buildings not working, and it wasn't great. We have similar problems today with, poor apartment complex, in poor areas, not being maintained very well, people living in kind of less than ideal circumstances. But at this time, it was even more extreme, because at this time you kind of had the kind of extreme unfettered type of capitalism where, people were very much commoditized, and it was completely reasonable to pack poor people into living conditions like you see there, because they were not seen as human, essentially. They were seen as a business product. I really think it's funny how the CED refers to the results of urbanization as a variety of challenges. It cracks me up. But you had pollution, you had growing crime, the poor sanitation and health conditions led to health crises and outbreaks of disease. Like I said, infrastructure was crumbling in some places, could not keep up with the demand that was being placed on it. So for the vast majority of people, they saw conditions start to deteriorate pretty quickly. And so that then, again, feeds into revolution and reform movements that we've been talking about through the whole unit. So 5.10 is the review topic. It's always been throughout the entire CED that the last topic of each unit is a review topic. I want to point out that very clearly in the title there is an AP reasoning process mentioned, CCOT, or continuity and change over time. So you may kind of infer from that perhaps the LEQ that we're going to be writing on Thursday and Friday this week, that's going to be centered on Unit 5, and Unit 5 is centered on CCOT, there may be something to that, and there may be a reason why I'm putting that right in your face a couple times. Maybe. But just understand this is one of the 3 reasoning processes that the College Board expects you to know going into the test. So the question we're being asked, kind of an overall question for Unit 5, is to what extent did industrialization cause CCOT? To what extent did it cause change, mostly, but also continuity over time? So these are some of the changes, some of the core areas of change that you need to really understand and kind of be able to talk about at length. So biggest change on the front end, or not the biggest change, but one of the biggest changes is capitalism. And with that, the rise of consumerism and the increased availability and affordability of consumer goods. You had innovations that connected interior regions to coastal regions. That was another big change. Of course, all the revolutions and rebellions that we've talked about, and we're going to review some of them today, are examples of change. I mean, anytime you have a government overthrown, there's some change there. And it's based on Enlightenment ideals. Now, this is an interesting area of some sort of continuity, though, because a big part of the Enlightenment, beyond some of the ideals we're going to talk about in the next slide, so I won't go in a few slides, but is this last part, the re-examination of the role of religion. That should sound familiar to you going back to the Renaissance, right? So that's a continuity in Western Europe, that the role of religion has been kind of under attack, I don't know what you want to call it, but it has been changing in Europe throughout the last 2 units, essentially, and that continues throughout this time. And then nationalism, which is below that annoying toolbar down the bottom. Nationalism is another example of change, of the rise of this idea of nation states. That was a new way for people to see themselves and to see each other. So in terms of capitalism as a change, remember, it replaces mercantilism as the dominant economic ideology for Western Europe, but really spreads from there. And as we've talked about, by this time, the influence of Western Europe on the rest of the world is pretty evident. There's some terms there that you need to know. Remember, of course, anything you see in pink is either directly mentioned or, as Freeman likes to say on his website, implied by the CED. So sometimes they don't mention a specific word or a specific person, but to understand what they're talking about, you need to be aware of that person, place, or thing. So So those are some terms that you should know. We really literally don't have time to go through everything, but we have. So that's what I meant about referring to previous slides or to previous presentations. I do see that extra space there, which is now annoying me after laissez-faire. Anyway, you need to know Adam Smith, who's a Scottish economist, father of capitalism, the kind of original promoter of the free market and free trade. Cecil Rhodes was the founder of De Beers Mining, which hopefully you remember from not last week, but the week before, that created that kind of diamond monopoly. He's another one that you'll want to probably know his name in association with transnational corporations and, like I said, a monopoly in his specific instance. So, of course, then from change was more change. In other words, from the change of capitalism, you had responses to that. Mostly with people that were not happy with the existing power structures that were in place wherever they were living. And oftentimes capitalism was either changing these in ways that people didn't like or reinforcing things that people didn't like. So some new ideologies you need to know: socialism and communism. Utilitarianism is another one we talked about. You probably do want to know. Beyond that, this also was related to the rise of labor movements as workers sought improved conditions for their working environments. So that's, kind of along the same lines as a response to capitalism and a response to the excesses that were being experienced during the Industrial Revolution. Karl Marx is a German economic theorist, father of communism, kind of the response to Adam Smith in a way, if you want to think of it that way. You should also know Michael Sadler. He wrote a report that documented working conditions for children and was a proponent of limiting their working hours, and kind of was one of the first people that really, from a government perspective, was looking at improving the outcomes for workers. So other changes or innovations of the industrial era were the way things were being produced, of course. You had the factory system, replaced cottage industries. Remember, this concentrated production into fewer and fewer areas. That, of course, then contributes to urbanization, because if you have the production being more concentrated, the people will need to be as well and be kind of close by to work in the areas of production. There again are some terms that you should know. James Watt as a key figure here. He's the guy that improved the steam engine, which was kind of a key cornerstone invention to the others that would follow. Henry Ford developed the assembly line, which was required for mass production. That mass production was required for the growing consumerism that I was talking about earlier. So the ability to mass produce things was how there was more stuff available to buy, how it was more affordable, and how there was more variety of it. And then lastly, you do need to know those innovations that helped connect inland areas and their resources to the coast. So before this time, you either needed to be on the coast or along really a river to have access to the global trade network. Now with canals and railroads, you didn't. Steamships allowed stuff to get places quicker, and the telegraph allowed people to talk to each other over long distances as well. So as we just talked about, the middle class is another change, okay, but that change is a part of an overall change in the distribution and concentration and availability of wealth, okay? So from wealth being something that wasn't really even attainable to most people to there being a middle class that was participating in its creation and enjoyment, that's a huge change that went on during this period. Beyond the classes and social hierarchies within civilizations or within societies, you also had societies trying to kind of keep up with each other, right? Particularly those that were not in the West, looking to the industrialization and the modernization that was going on and feeling the need to keep up themselves. But remember, those reforms were often resisted by people that were already in power, that were already elite. If you were an elite, a member of nobility in a specific area, and all of a sudden there's a burgeoning middle class, you probably were opposed to that middle class just on the basis of not wanting to lose your own relative position in society. So there was a lot of resistance internally, and again, there's examples there that you need to know, all stuff we've gone through. So as you kind of see that, that's stuff that you can refer back to the previous slides But like I said, everything there should be familiar to you by now. I try not to duplicate too many slides. I did duplicate this, but the only point that I'm trying to make here is that the Enlightenment ideals themselves, while yes, a continuity in some ways, particularly in their relation to religion, did promote a huge amount of change a lot of times through revolution, right? Through political revolution. Because a lot of the political revolutions that we're going to talk about were the result of these ideas spreading first, okay? So empiricism, the idea that all knowledge is based on what you can actually see. You need to know the term classical liberalism, and be careful with the word liberalism because it means many, in a modern context, this word essentially has no meaning. And what I'm trying to say there is, you'll see this word being used to describe progressive people, socialist people, leftist people, centrist people, even kind of conservative people, because depending on who you are, this word means something different. When we talk about classical liberalism, we're talking about the notion that individuals have certain freedoms, certain natural rights, they should be able to own private property, and they should be subject to and protected by the rule of law. A lot of this, I mean, the ownership of private property, right, and a certain amount of freedom, those are very much tied up in capitalist notions that would be very much not what a modern kind of leftist would be in favor of. But if you turn on certain news channels, they'll refer to those people as being liberals, or a lot of times you'll hear liberal and socialist being kind of interchanged now. And that's wild because they mean essentially opposite things, or in certain senses opposite things. So I'm highlighting that as a word that you're going to see throughout your life that you should start thinking about as like, what does that mean, and understanding that every time you see it, you're going to have to distill its meaning a little bit. Natural rights, the idea that we have, you'll see this as God-given rights sometimes, but just rights derived inherently from the universe, not from government. Those are legal rights. The social contract, the idea that we give up some freedom to live in a society and have the safety and rules that it provides for us. And like I said kind of just before, remember that these ideas often kind of appear and precede revolutions and rebellions that took place, all over the world at this time. So those are some of the revolutions we're talking about, and I'm going to go through some examples here in a second. But in terms of non-revolution movements, nationalism is really born of the Enlightenment, the idea that people were kind of looking at their own individual value to an extent, and therefore could reevaluate their position in society relative to others. Remember, nationalism is just a sense of unity based on shared commonalities. So could be language, could be religion, could be customs, could be geography, but just based on something shared between you and the other. Some of the reform movements that we've talked about would be the abolition movement. This map shows you when slavery was abolished in different parts of the world. This map shows you when women were able to vote in different parts of the world. Yes, last year was 100 years of that in the United States. So that means probably at least all of your great-grandparents were born into a world where people could not vote. There are people alive where women could not vote. There are people alive today who were born when women could not vote. So that is not that long ago. And then we talked about the labor movements before too. Those were all of these movements are born of Enlightenment ideals. And then the revolutions, of course, are much more directly, because that usually involved people overthrowing their rulers for not kind of respecting the rights or the natural kind of privileges that Enlightenment thinkers thought we all had. So I'm just going to go through in a very, very summary way these revolutions. There's just too much to possibly go through. If I talked to you this entire class, we wouldn't even cover a fraction of what we need to know here. So I'm just, again, hitting the highlights. So U.S. Revolution, you probably are familiar with the date, July 4th, 1776. The war is kind of born out of, or the revolution is born out of angst around the British levying taxes against the colonies to pay for war debts with France. A lot of that war debt was defending the colonies from France, so Britain felt the colonists should be participating in the repayment of that. The colonists, as you might imagine, did not. So they declared their independence and established a republic. that became a kind of inspiration for other reform movements or revolution movements around the world, really. France supported the colonies. Remember, they're warring with Great Britain quite a bit. There is some thought about they had some kind of ulterior motive here about trying to, take control of the colonies, but one way or the other, they did not. They allied with them, and Enlightenment thinkers were very influential on the framers of the Constitution. That's not the Constitution, that's the Declaration of Independence, but Locke, for instance, Jefferson basically just copies Locke's thinking in the Declaration of Independence, and then in the structures of government, we can see Enlightenment thinkers really throughout. The French Revolution has too many dates to possibly even list, so I debated even just kind of pulling this. But essentially, it starts in 1789. There's a period of reforms. France had gone through a lot of urbanization, had rapid population growth, had huge economic inequality, unemployment, and people were not happy. We're talking about the masses here. So there was general unrest, kind of widespread, with the way things had been done for quite a while. So people demanded reforms. The reforms start then, but by 792 they get rid of the monarchy. This was kind of moving to a constitutional monarchy and adopt a republic, similar to the United States. There's a Revolutionary War in between. However, that was pretty short-lived. So the First Republic is 1792. The Third Republic is 1870. So yes, there's a Second Republic in between those two. Also between those two, you have the rise of Napoleon, and you have France going from a republic to a monarchy to an empire to a republic to a monarchy to an empire and back to a republic by 1870. So that's what I'm getting at. There's way too much conflict here, and there's way too much change to go through all of it in any meaningful way. But what you need to understand is just France, starting from 1789, goes into this really tumultuous period, and basically by 1870 is kind of out of it. The Third Republic is a fairly lasting government. I think that was to the 1940s. So the Third Republic lasted for quite a while. Now, this revolution is different because, again, it's like popular unrest that caused it, whereas in the American Revolution or the U.S. Revolution, it was response to specific policies that had been changed against them, and the colonists already had a fair amount of freedom. This was a response to basically getting rid of an absolutist type system and wanting to replace it with a more democratic one. That's going to be inspirational for the Russian Revolution, which had a similar dynamic going on, and just that notion of like revolution for the sake of equality, which there's a lot of mention of that in the U.S. documents and the way we talk about things, but it certainly wasn't kind of the cornerstone in the same way it was for the French Revolution. In the American Revolution, you still have slavery at the end of it. Of course you do. Like, it's a big part of what happens next, right? You do not have a very equal society that's born of it, and that's not really the goal of what was done, right? So the freedom we're talking about there was a different kind of freedom than what the French were demanding. There's some people down there that you would want to know about when that's gone. Louis XVI is there about to get his head chopped off, so that's good fun. That was obviously a tool of the French Revolution. The Haitian Revolution starts in 1791 with a revolt of enslaved people that was ultimately successful. By 1804, they are an independent state. Again, in those 13 years, you have a period where England's in charge, Britain's in charge. You have a period of time where the French get back in charge again. So you have a lot that happens in those 13 years. But by 1804, Haiti is an independent nation. It's really unique in that it was the only successful revolt of this kind where you had a non-white government then that kind of was replaced the colonial government that went before it. After independence, I talked about this, I think, when we went through this the first time, briefly, but after independence, Haiti was really isolated from the white-controlled governments around it. They were seeking, for instance, closer ties to the United States, but that was hard because the United States was a white-controlled, essentially British country, or British-derived country, and felt threatened, essentially, by Haiti's mere existence. There were other things that did not help that. There was basically the first government of Haiti was a pretty. Sorry, I think the cat just fell. The first government of Haiti was fairly authoritarian. They actually executed the white people that remained in Haiti immediately. And so that was one example of like Haiti was seeking closer ties with the U.S. and in the response to their request for closer ties, it was like, well, how could we have closer ties with you when you're exterminating all white people from your part of the island when we're a white majority country at that stage. So it's not to say anything was Haiti's fault specifically, but they also weren't doing themselves favors. So between the two of them, it made their development very difficult, but they were also very inspirational to the many kind of reform movements that were going on, and the abolition movements, especially in the Americas, abolition of slavery movements, I mean. So in Latin America, you have kind of all kinds of revolutions that went on, but it's all kind of born out of Napoleon's decision to invade the Iberian Peninsula. Because when that happened, and France controls the Iberian Peninsula for a brief period of time, or at least the Spain part, and Portugal more or less, the governments that were in control over this part of the world essentially kind of stopped existing for a moment. And so you had some loyal groups that kind of took control then of the territories that they were living in kind of briefly. You had kind of local insurrection movements as well. And then eventually you have independent states that kind of get declared. But you can see there's a return to Spanish rule as well in some parts of Latin America. So it's a messy period. It's a messy kind of process is what I'm saying. So at this point, 1808, everything's under Spanish control. By 1809, you have loyal governments, but it's not under control because now you have Iberia being taken, right? So then you have local insurrection movements, you have independent states for a moment, but then Spain is going to recreate itself, or Spain will be in control of Spain again. And when that happens, then this changes. You can see how those things are kind of related. And then after this one, it goes back to being under control of the Spanish for a brief period of time. But by 1816, Argentina is independent and part of the northern kind of section of South Americas as well. And then by the 1820s, you'll see it really kind of, a lot of this is green by then. Interesting story, or interesting to note, Portugal's royal family actually escaped to Brazil during the time when Napoleon was taking over Iberia. Initially, they didn't want to go back. They wanted to stay in Brazil, but were kind of essentially forced to. But that directly led to Brazilian independence because one of the royal family members actually goes back. For a brief time, he's king of both, but ultimately declares in a peaceful way independence for Brazil. And between that and Brazil remaining one territory, so in other words, the Spanish, when they colonized the Americas, broke this up into different territories. The Portuguese did not. They left Brazil as one territory. And so between that and the intervention, essentially, of the royal family, you can pretty much see why Brazil is what it is today in terms of one large state instead of multiple smaller states. Bolivar is a name to know there, but again, not the only one. But he was, particularly for the northern end of South America, the northern coast, he was very influential in the revolution movements there. The Spanish-American War is one to know. That's when the United States essentially takes control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. It starts when the U.S. decides to support Cuba in their war for independence from Spain. However, the result of the war was that the U.S. took control over all those territories, including Cuba, which it entered the war to support their independence. So that's just kind of a little bit strange, right? This is kind of the start of the end of the Spanish Empire. They still had some territory in Africa, but it's really, like, their overseas possessions are kind of really waning at this point. From 1904, you have independence parties that start forming in Puerto Rico, seeking independence from the U.S. now, not from Spain. But there were independence movements before that, seeking independence from Spain itself. They were inspired by patriotic poetry and novels One poet you need to know about is Lola Rodriguez de Tio. But again, not the only person, but just someone that's mentioned specifically in the CED. Her poetry was, like I said, an inspirational part of. Sorry, let me just see. I've got a DM real quick. No worries. All right. Well, I'll be posting this video anyway. I've talked about that a little bit before, but I'll answer that in 1 second. Or not 1 second when I get toward the end of this. The Philippines, the next one to know about. So they weren't seeking independence from Spain. The propaganda movement, which is a term you need to know, actually was seeking equality with Spain, and they wanted to be basically a part of Spain. They wanted to be a province of Spain with representation and citizenship instead of being a colony of Spain. So that's what they were seeking. But that changes in 1898 because now they are no longer under control of the Spanish. So from that point onward, then you really had them trying to become independent from the U.S. Just 1 year later, there was an attempted revolution. There was a Philippine-American War. The United States won that very handily and controlled the Philippines for the foreseeable future until we get into the next unit. Understand here, by the way, propaganda just means that they were advocating for the Philippines. In other words, don't think of the modern sense of like evil propaganda. When you hear that word, I know there's a connotation that it's like misinformation meant to like lie to the populace. In this instance, it wasn't. In this instance, it was basically just marketing, advocating for the Philippines and for it to be part of Spain. Jose Rizal, someone you need to know. He's the, not the, but one of the leaders of the propaganda movement and is kind of a national hero in the Philippines. So you've seen these maps before. We're going to talk about the unification of Germany and the unification of Italy. And so this shows you in 1750 how very ununified, or not unified, these places are, and then Italy and Germany existing by 1900. This process wasn't complete until a little bit later, but we'll talk about that in a second. So German unification, first of all. So German nationalism is interesting because it was, the roots of it are in the fact that throughout this part of the world, being Prussia and then getting into really Central Europe here, people spoke the same language. They felt like they had a shared history from having recently been under kind of the influence and control of Napoleon in France. Before that, the Holy Roman Empire. Also, at different times, they had incursions of Russians into their territory. So between all of that, these people started seeing themselves as kind of having a shared history. They spoke the same language. They also tried to seek better economic ties to one another. They created a trade union to remove basically barriers to trade among the different states that existed here at the time. They also worked collaboratively to build new infrastructure, so the roads and weren't in very good shape, and they didn't have railroads. Well, they worked together to build that. And so by the time you get to Otto von Bismarck, there was a pretty strong sense of this group at least trying to work together for their benefit. That is kind of like a proto-nationalism of sorts, right? And so then you have wars between the Prussians and Austria and the Prussians and France. So now you have this group of people that shares a language, feels like they share a history, they've been working together on trade, they've been working together to improve their infrastructure, and now they're working together to fight common enemies around them. And that's kind of the final galvanizing thing that allows Germany to become a state and allows Otto von Bismarck to successfully unify Germany into one state. Now, shortly after they were created, they made the decision that it was important for their actual survival to ally with at least two of Austria, Russia, and France. They saw the three of them as the biggest threats to the survival of Germany, and so they thought the safest way to ensure that they would not end up basically having like Austria and Russia, let's say, team up to fight them, or having Austria and France team up, whatever. They thought the best way to do that would be to become allies with at least two of them. So they allied with the Austrians, with the Russians, and with the Italians. And that's going to be very important when we go into the next time period. If you've studied World War I, you have a sense of what I'm talking about. Italian unification is after this, but not too far after. So remember, before this, you had the Holy Roman Empire controlling northern Italy. You had the Papal States controlling central Italy. You had the Kingdom of Naples down here. At one point in time, you had Spain controlling Sardinia and Sicily, I believe. But by this point, you have the Kingdom of Sardinia controlling Sardinia and kind of the northwestern part of what we'd say is Italy today, Genoa, that kind of stuff. And then after Napoleon kind of took control over a lot of this area for a while, and after he was no longer in power, there was the Congress of Vienna. And that broke Italy into a bunch of kind of smaller independent states. That created conflict as these states were kind of, not only in conflict with each other, but also like this state over here was very much under the influence of Austria. Over here, of course, there was going to be a strong French influence. This down here saw itself as kind of independent for a while, so had its own ideas for what the future should be. So the point is, these disparate groups kind of had their own views of how things should go, essentially. But between a kind of a series of wars and just independence movements within the different groups, you had calls for unification that over time, slowly, not the way Germany happened, very slowly, fully unified the territory. You can see the time frame here. But it wasn't completely unified until after World War I. So, like I said, this process was quite a bit different than what we saw with Germany. There was growing Balkan nationalism during this time. Remember the Balkan Peninsula? Hopefully you remember from, I think, World War I. You've got the Balkan Peninsula here and the Peloponnesian Peninsula down here. Anyone remember what Turkey is? You guys should know. It's actually on the map, too. Anyone that had me last year should definitely know this. I can't speak to anyone else. However, there you go. And see, you didn't even have me last year. So yeah, Anatolian Peninsula. So it's all peninsulas here. That's all I'm saying. Anatolia. It's right here too. It is also called Asia Minor, though. So that's kind of just this whole region. Anyway, all right. So the Balkan Peninsula is here, and at this point, it's under control of the Ottoman Empire. All right, but the Ottoman Empire is falling behind technologically. It's also controlling a very disparate group of people. So from Orthodox Christians, some Catholics, and then now down here into North Africa as well, Middle East, Turkey, and even getting into like Central Asia. The point is, they had a very disparate empire with very different groups of people. And between that and their weakening kind of relative to technology, what was coming out of Europe at the time, it was just kind of the end of the Ottoman Empire. And so as a result of that, you had these Balkan states start kind of forming, and you had independence movements start forming in them as they kind of saw the writing on the wall, essentially, and understood that there was going to be an opportunity for some change. But you can see it's very messy. You can see the years here. You can see sometimes, Austria-Hungary, for instance, is controlling different parts of the northern end that was closest to them. Bulgaria was a lot bigger originally, and then was made a lot smaller. There were a lot of changes, but these are some of the Balkan national movements that you need to know. Now, this also, like I said, was messy though. So between 1878, which is when the Russians really hand the Ottoman Empire a very large defeat that results in the Congress of Berlin and the creation of all these new states. From 1878 to World War I, you actually had 2 whole wars that were fought in this part of the world over control. And I'm talking about like widespread wars that were in multiple regions here. So it was a very, very messy part of the world, and actually, still to this day, there's a lot of conflict associated with this part of the world. And part of that is because of the lines that were drawn during this time with disparate people being kind of brought under different nationalist banners. So we've talked about the revolutions, we've talked about unification in Italy and Germany, talked about the Philippines as well. We're going to touch on Ottomanism and the New Zealand Wars, and I think that's it. So, Maori nationalism. Hopefully, you know, New Zealand is a British colony at this point, and the British were kind of taking more and more land from the indigenous people that lived there, the Maori, or Mary. And understand when they arrived, this was not one state. These were different groups living independent from each other. So there wasn't like a king of the Marys or something like that. It was, like I said, a whole bunch of different disparate groups. And over time, the British were taking more and more of their land. This gets to the point where the indigenous groups felt the need to fight back. Now, it wasn't all of them. Some of the Maori groups decided to ally with the Brits. The result of this was defeat for the Marys and victory for the British, who then took even more land to punish the Mary for the rebellion. What's interesting is they punished not only the ones that fought against them, they also punished the ones that allied with them. So they were pretty brutal in their response. During this time, you had the King movement, where they did actually try to unify under one king, because they thought that would better counter British power. But between the fact that they were not actually under one banner, between the fact that they did not have the same technology as the British that were arriving, they were not successful in their defense of most of their land, and as a result, huge tracts of it were taken by the British. And today, you know, when we think of New Zealand, it's a, you know, former British country. So, lastly, Ottomanism. Ottomanism is Ottoman nationalism. Okay, that's all that really means. And so, you know, circle back to what I said before. Remember, the Ottoman Empire is not in a good position. It is not strong at this time. And so it started having kind of this introspective period where it tried to change itself. We talked about the Tanzimat reforms before, how they tried to kind of modernize modes of dress, modernize some technology, modernize their military. But also, like I said before, they were controlling a very diverse group of people. And the goal of kind of Ottoman nationalism or Ottomanism was to make someone, whether they were living in Bosnia and the Balkans, or whether they were living in Egypt, or whether they were living in Saudi Arabia, or whether they were living in Istanbul, to all see themselves as Ottomans first, to see themselves as Ottoman nationals first. This was not successful. Like I said, there were the Balkan national movements in response. But it was a precursor for Kemalism and kind of Turkish nationalism that would follow. Hopefully you know the name Sultan Mahmud II. Remember, he was the forerunner who kind of led those Tanzimat reforms kind of before they got started. And that is it for the slides, guys.